My name is Troy Richardson. I have the privilege this semester to lead the seminar series, the American Indian Speaker Series, which is also a co-seminar, and we do have several students enrolled in this as a course. I'm coming to you from the Oconee and Tuscarora peoples of what is now Virginia and North Carolina. And I find myself situated here in traditional territories of the Cayuga people, in the larger Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I want to also acknowledge the staff of the American Indian Program, Ugo Mansfield, Natani Nota, Kathy Halby, and Mario, for helping bring our speaker series to life each semester. And I personally am very grateful, and of course Jolene and Rickard for helping lead the overall program and our efforts. So again, it's a real privilege to be part of this effort and to be able to host scholars like Patrick Wolfe this morning. I've selected an image actually of Jolene's to put up in the context of the essay that Patrick provided to us for our seminar, because it seemed to me to speak really to precisely the elements that he's navigating, and I think will be navigating in his talk today. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight the questions that he opens the reading with as a way to introduce him. He writes, in the contemporary Western Academy, especially in the United States, the repudiation of binarism partakes of a certain sacredness. Not only are its premises unquestionable, though they certainly are, more strictly and in keeping with the Durkheimian fundamentals, the repudiation of binarism expresses membership of a collectivity that constitutes the source and origin of righteousness. So this is a broad, important theme, of course, of Patrick's work. And he kind of ends this section by asking a series of questions that I'd like to also reiterate. Why should it be that the specter of binarism, so disturbing to non-native sensibilities, should be less troubling to natives? More provocatively, could it be that the repudiation of binarism itself constitutes a colonizing perspective? And again, I just couldn't help but think of this image by Jolene in terms of that question. And I'll leave it to you all to kind of interpret what I think I'm seeing with her work here on the question of binarism and the repudiation of binarism as a colonizing perspective. Patrick Wolfe is a freelance historian who lives and works in Wurundjeri country near Healesville, Australia. He works comparatively on race, colonialism, settler colonialism, and the history of ideas. His books include Settler Colonialism and the Transformation of Anthropology, and the forthcoming, which is from what I'm reading from, Traces of History, Elementary Structures of Race. His article Against the Intentional Fallacy, Logocentrism, and Continuity in the Rhetoric of Indian Dispossession was awarded the Native American Indigenous Studies Association Article Prize for 2012. And I would just add, just kind of as a final comment, that his work has had a profound impact in the fields that I work in Indigenous education, for example. And so help me welcome and thank Patrick for his work and his presentation today.
I'm privileged to be able to talk in Cayuga territory, so I offer my respects to the Cayuga people, to Cayuga elders past and present. I offer my thanks, heartfelt thanks, to Jolene Rickards, Director of the American Indian Program, for a kind invitation and facilitating my travel here, to Ulrich Mansfield, who has put up with my, let's say, episodic travel arrangements and has made all the arrangements I've needed to be here very comfortable. Thank you, Ulrich. And Troy, who's be so gracious to me this morning. Thank you very much, all of you. The article that has been pre-circulated is the introduction, actually not to the one you mentioned, it's to an edited collection that's coming out in about a month. University, UCLA, Indian Studies Centre Press, and it's called, what is it called? It's called The Settler Complex, Recuperating Binarism in Colonial Studies. And you've got the introduction to it. So I'm going to not talk directly to that, on the assumption that at least some people have read it, so I don't want to just repeat what you already know. I'm just going to give another paper which I think relates to it, if that's okay. And I'd like to start with, it's going to be in two parts, the second. Something that came up over lunch yesterday, Chad, who isn't here, questioned me about the term territoriality. So I thought that was such an interesting question that, excuse me, I just want to say something about what I mean by the term territoriality. That's the first part, and the second part is I want to say something about Indigenous politics in Australia in a comparative vein. So I'll start with the term territoriality as I use it. The term refers to the fusion of peoples and territories. Territoriality is a relationship, a collective mode of being. Peoples typically define themselves in relation to particular stretches of territory, which they may or may not actually occupy. By the way, the relationship to territory constitutes human collectivities as distinct peoples. Territoriality forms the core of their collective selfhood. Thus, territoriality is much more than a geographical concept. In its anthropological or social-psychological aspect, different territorialities reflect the different concepts and connectivities that link peoples to the land that define them, whether through the immediacy of settled possession or the nostalgia of exile. Territorialities in this sense are so many expressions and collectively lived modalities of belonging, the disciplinary terrain of anthropology, sociology, social psychology, cultural studies and related disciplines. Above all, territorialities are human constructs, dialectical and representational, cultural and expressive, historical and political. Their relationship to natural territoriality, or to the so-called territorial imperative, is as that between architecture and honeycomb building. I'm sorry, it's a really terrible thing to do, but I'm actually responding, Chad, to something you said yesterday, which you weren't to know, right? So I'm starting with explaining what I mean by the term territoriality. So thanks for, motivating this. More formally, territorialities are the concern of law and politics. Here too, the concept is inherently plural, not just in the anthropological sense that there are different cultural constructs of territoriality, but in the juridico-political sense that territorialities often overlap, with different peoples asserting conflicting claims to the same stretches of land. Palestinians and Israelis are by no means alone in finding themselves mutually defined by rival claims to the same territory. Native peoples all over the world find themselves locked into long-run historical relationships in which comparable issues are at stake. These relationships do not necessarily involve European colonizers. In this connection, I also have in mind peoples such as the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Kurds, West Papuans, Khoisan, and Santals. Comparative lessons are to be drawn from the inclusion of such people's historical experiences, along with the more familiar experiences of native peoples within Western settler colonial states. Territoriality is central to discourses of sovereignty, encompassing law, politics, and international relations, extending at the phenomenological level to the micropolitics of individual subject formation, as colonized or colonizer, as native or settler, etc. Fourth world and indigenous populations within nation-states typically maintain countervailing claims to the territories of states into which they have been incorporated. Irredentist minorities, enclaved within nation-states from which they regard themselves as distinct, assert collective identities of displacement. Stateless populations, such as the Basques, Kurds or Lahu, assert ancestral claims to territories situated in more than one nation-state, while reservations belonging to indigenous nations such as the Iroquois or the Navajo cut across the boundaries dividing modern settler nation-states. The modern, this is the crunch line, the modern nation-state is therefore but one example of territoriality, albeit the dominant one in the contemporary world order. Alongside and within the nation-state, and in varying degrees of tension with it, there exist numerous other territorialities. Some represent earlier or residual formations, traditional homeland orientations that the nation-state has only partly incorporated or not fully superseded. Others constitute transnational or global alternatives to the nation-state, consciously counter-state collectivities framed in religious, ethnic or racial terms that incorporate a territorial referent, back to Africa, return to Zion, etc. Or which, as in the case of Sinti and Rom peoples, so-called gypsies, are defined in opposition to territorial fixity, while forcibly removed native societies have established displaced bonds with new homelands. Others, in particular ecological movements, strive for novel pan-human territorialities, seeking politically creative reconceptualizations of the relationship between people and territory on a global scale. All these alternatives to the nation-state are so because they configure the relationship between peoples and territories in ways that diverge from and or conflict with the sovereign territoriality that underlies and constitutes the post-Westphalian nation-state form presupposed in contemporary international relations. Thus, the study of territorialities incorporates but goes beyond studies of nations and nationalism. For similar reasons, the study of territorialities also incorporates but goes beyond settler colonial studies, so I wish to suggest here. Whereas settler colonial studies consciously set itself up as a critique of post-colonialism, this wiggly thing around the post and post-colonialism, arguing that colonialism persists into the present in the invasive relationship between settler nation-states and the indigenous populations that they have conquered. The study of territorialities is not so much a critique of settler colonial studies as a larger category that contains and exceeds it. The clash of territorialities, native and settler, that constitutes the object of settler colonial studies exemplifies a wider global phenomenon. Territorialities are distinctive of all nation-states, whether settler or otherwise. Moreover, as indicated, they are also distinctive of a range of non-state human collectivities, both historically and into the present. So that's kind of the first half, and in relation to Chad's prompt yesterday, I was moved to wanting to relativize the nation-state formation in relation to territories. That seems to me to be historically and politically a worthwhile thing that we can do. So that's kind of the first half. And I'm very sorry, I've looked at the time when I started, but I started about past, would you say?
Yes.
So should I go to about 10 past? Is that better? Great, okay. So I want to talk in a rather general way, which ends up coming into the Australian experience, a major distinction between Australian Indigenous people's experience and most, but not all, Native American people's experience. Not some in the Northeast and not some in California, but so far as the generality of Indigenous peoples in this country are concerned, sovereignty and treaties can be taken for granted. In Australia, there's a complete absence of that. So, whilst that is a major distinction, the circumscribed nature of US sovereignty discourse is such that I question it's such as a potential difference. So I want to sort of move into that by way of entering into a description of the Australian situation. Historically speaking, Australia followed the United States, a chronology that involved a degree of replication. While the differences between these two white Anglo-settler colonies are as marked as the continuities, I should say incidentally that when I say United States, I mean the continental mainland United States, Hawaii and Alaska are different stories, and I didn't want to collapse them together. Okay, so I'll start again. Historically speaking, Australia followed the United States, a chronology that involved a degree of replication. While the differences between these two white Anglo-settler colonies are as marked as the continuities, the colonisation of Australia was too closely bound up with Britain's North American embarrassment to be considered separately. Settler policies in Australia were significantly informed by lessons learnt in North America. An obvious example is the avoidance of slavery. Of even greater significance for a discussion of race in Australia is the avoidance of native sovereignty. These twin absences, both reversing British colonial policy in North America, would have major consequences for the regime of race that settlers constructed in Australia. As has often been noted, the dominant factor in the sequential relationship between Britain's establishment of settler colonies in North America and Australia, which is originally called New Holland, but they call it Australia, the dominant factor was the Industrial Revolution. This is not only because English factories relied on colonial production for their raw materials, a consideration that did not significantly motivate the initial invasion of Australia. Of much greater significance for Australia was the Malthusian demographic problem, the ominously named redundant population, that industrialisation, especially the element of enclosure, was presenting to authorities in Britain. Prior to losing the War of Independence, Britain had been using its North American colonies, especially the southern ones, to export the largely urban surplus population that enclosure and industrialisation had generated, whether as convicted felons, as indentured labour, or as paupers. After 1783, however, as Richard Copeland put it, independent America could no longer be used as a British dustbin. The victorious Republicans' preferred source of exploitable labour being African rather than English, and vested with even fewer rights, the loss of the 13 colonies had an immediate effect on the English landscape, as waterways crowded with prison hulks presented the most concrete domestic symptom of colonial defeat. Due no doubt to the scrupulous Eurocentrism that James Clifford has noted of him, Michel Foucault did not remark on the fullness with which the colonisation of Australia combined the narratives of his Madness and Civilization and Discipline and Punish. Even the watery containment of the median condition, ship of fools or convict hulk, was common to both transitions, that from North America to Australia and that from leprous marginality to the Great Confinement. Had Foucault been more alert to colonialism, he might have noted that the historical progression on from the hulks or from an overcrowded Newgate prison did not only lead to Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, it also led to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, which later became Tasmania. This is not to try to score points from Foucault. It is rather to stress the intimacy between colonialism and modernity. The colonial doctrine of race provided an expedient resolution to the logical affront that colonialism presented to liberal democratic ideology. As incubators and developers of modernity, Australian settlers would be in the vanguard of a number of democratic movements, including those for women's suffrage and trade union rights. At the same time, they would dispossess and maltreat Aborigines with all the ruthlessness of settlers elsewhere. Lorenzo Veracini has perceptively assigned these two characteristics of settler discourse, egalitarianism among themselves, combined with exterminism towards natives, to settlers' respective positioning in relation to metropolitan authority, the constraints of which settlers were united in resisting, and to native territoriality, the claims to which settlers were united in suppressing. So that this twin characteristic of democratic egalitarianism on the one hand and genocidal practices on the other are not contradictory, they're just different objects, different dimensions to the same condition. For Indigenous people, the concept of settler democracy can only be a contradiction in terms. Their attrition at the hands of that democracy reflects the core feature of settler colonialism, which is first and foremost a project of replacement. Settlers come to stay. In relation to natives, as I have argued, settler colonialism is governed by logic of elimination. In destroying to replace, this logic encompasses more than the summary liquidation of indigenous people. In common with genocide, as Raphael Lemkin characterized it, settler colonialism has both negative and positive dimensions. Negatively, it strives for the dissolution of native societies. Positively, the ongoing requirement to eliminate the native alternative continues to shape the colonial society that settlers construct on their expropriated land base. In this positive sense, the logic of elimination marks a return whereby the native repressed continues to structure settler colonial society. Thus, elimination should be seen positively. By positive, I don't mean in a good light, I mean as productive of reality. Thus, elimination should be seen positively as an organising principle of settler colonial society, rather than as a one-off and superseded occurrence. As Theodor Herzl, founding father of Zionism, observed in his allegorical manifesto novel, "If I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct." In a kind of realization that took place half a century later, the one-time deputy mayor of West Jerusalem, Meron Ben-Venisti, recalled, "As a member of a pioneering youth movement, I myself made the desert bloom by uprooting the ancient olive trees of Al-Bassa to clear the ground for a banana grove as required by the planned farming principles of my kibbutz, Rosh Hanikra." Invasion is a structure, not an event. Thus, the continuing operations of the logic of elimination in the wake of the frontier can include officially encouraged miscegenation, the breaking down of native title into alien individual freeholds, native citizenship, child abduction, religious conversion, resocialization in total institutions such as missions or boarding schools, and a whole range of cognate biocultural assimilations. All these strategies, including frontier homicide, are modalities of settler colonialism. All of them come back to the issues of land and territoriality. Territoriality, the fusion of people and land, is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. Settlers' seizure of native land is not simply a transfer of ownership. That can occur in a regular fashion within a system of ownership, by sale, inheritance, foreclosure, and the like, rival claims being resolvable by appropriate arbitration. Rather than replacing one owner with another, settlers seek to replace an entire system of ownership with another. The settler-native confrontation, in other words, is not between claims to ownership, but between frameworks for allocating ownerships. It is between sovereignties, which are primordially external to one another. As Henry Reynolds observed, there has always been an international dimension to the relationship between Aborigines and the colonists, Aborigines meaning Indigenous Australians. This is a controversial remark to make in Australia because the whole idea of international in relation to Aborigines is completely denied in the absence of sovereignty being acknowledged or treaties having taken place. So that's a kind of more controversial remark than what we've made in this country about Indigenous Americans. Given this externality, the settler legal system resolves issues of ownership within its jurisdictional limits. The question of its own externality is simply and literally beyond the powers, it's ultra vires to settler legal systems. This is a straightforward matter that settler judiciaries typically express without qualms. To explain his denial of Indians' capacity to dispose of fee simple in their ancestral patrimony, for instance, Chief Justice John Marshall informed the US Supreme Court in the landmark case of Johnson and McIntosh that, quote, "This restriction," in other words, Indians being incapable of having fee simple or disposing of it, "this restriction may be opposed to natural right and to the usages of civilized nations, yet, if it be indispensable to that system under which this country has been settled and be adapted to the actual condition of the two people, it may perhaps be supported by reason and certainly cannot be questioned by courts of justice," by which, of course, he meant settler courts of justice. Marshall's position was faithfully echoed in the Australian case of Cohen the Commonwealth, which was devoted to the same question, and which concluded that the High Court of Australia had nothing to say about the claim that this land belonged to the Coe family because it was outside their jurisdiction. The same position was taken for granted in statements such as the High Court of Australia's key decision in the Yorta Yorta case, which held that, quote, "rights or interests in land created after sovereignty," by which they meant settled sovereignty, and which owed their origin and continued existence only to a normative system other than that of a new sovereign power, would not and will not be given effect by the legal order of the new sovereign. In other words, they just couldn't deal with it. The point is not to deplore these judgments. Given the circumstances, it is hard to see what else the judges could have said. The point is rather that having nothing to say about native sovereignty has precisely that effect. Nothing. Notice that the Yorta Yorta judges' new sovereign presupposed an old one. Marshall and the Australian judges were not creating the basis on which the systems of ownership they adjudicated were founded. They were simply acknowledging that it was not up to them to question that basis. The law was not created by the law. In Carl Schmitt's terminology, it was created exceptionally. Of itself, law does not conquer. It may express, legitimate, or even reinforce conquest, but these are elaborations on the datum of conquest which is achieved by other means. To assume that native sovereignty somehow evaporates in the aftermath of conquest is to go further than the judges, who remain silent on the matter. Accordingly, and it would seem consistently even with the judges' own accounts, tracking what happens to the externality of native sovereignty in the wake of the settler-native confrontation requires us to look outside the settler legal system, a requirement that takes us directly to the priority of force. Peoples do not surrender their collective inheritances voluntarily. Thus, there is no shortage of data relating to the force with which natives were dispossessed. But possession is not ownership, with which it may or may not coexist, as in the case of tenancies. Even within the terms of the settler legal system, therefore, let alone in terms of the native ones or in the space between the two, mere dispossession does not vitiate ownership, as is evidenced by the special requirements attending provisions such as adverse possession. Thus, the salient question to arise from the territorial dispossession of native peoples is not that of whether or not it happened, since there could be no doubting that. Rather, it is the question of the subsequent career of native ownership which mere dispossession does not compromise. The question, in other words, is one of strategy analysis. How do settler societies deal with autonomous systems of ownership that are not susceptible, or which survive, forcible seizure? This question acquires particular urgency in the context of a settler society's need to establish a rule of law with sufficient legitimacy to secure a viable level of consent to a recently promulgated set of social norms among an ever-aggregating and often diversely recruited immigrant populace. In other words, in the wake of the frontier, you can't just carry on, shooting natives on sight, because you have a potentially fractious bunch of immigrants who are constantly coming in from other places who have to be persuaded that it's a level playing field. Therefore, natives have to be incorporated apparently within that regular system of laws. For their own internal purposes, therefore, quite apart from international considerations, settler societies seek to neutralize the extraneous sovereignties that conquered natives continue to instantiate. The most direct way to achieve this is through the physical liquidation of the bearers of those sovereignties. This solution becomes increasingly less viable as natives are contained within the frontier, conflicting as it does with the emergent settler social order's requirement for the manifestation of due process. An alternative solution, exemplified in the US system of native treaties, is to secure a semblance of native consent to a transfer of ownership. Though this possibility was precluded in Australia, where native ownership was not recognised, so you can't persuade Indigenous people to give away something you don't even recognise them as having in the first place. A third solution is physical removal and or confinement, but this is a merely temporary or provisional expedient if it takes place within the boundaries, existing or projected, of the settler nation state. A more permanent strategy is that of assimilation, whereby natives' externality is sought to be dissolved through their incorporation into settler society. Incidentally, I hope I don't have to say to this audience, I'm not presenting any of this as a fait accompli. I'm presenting these as aims of settler discourse. Needless to say, they're significantly unsuccessful. Natives resist them in a variety of ways. Okay. So, just to make sure that that's understood. A more permanent strategy is that of assimilation, whereby natives' externality is sought to be dissolved through their incorporation into settler society. By this means, settler societies do not seek to resolve the problem of alternative systems of ownership. Rather, by doing away with alternative owners, they seek to obviate it. Assimilation, if it were to succeed, offers a more effective antidote to native sovereignty than simple denial, which merely defers the problem, thus risking the emergence of circumstances less favourable to denial, as in the case of the impact of post-war decolonisation on Australian Aboriginal policy, when suddenly the white man's paradise in the South Pacific found itself surrounded by independent nations run by brown people. It's provided enormous problems for Aboriginal policy. These shifting racial modalities reflect settler colonialism's inability to replace native society to court. So there's post-flight voice problems. The quest to replace native territoriality only maintains the refractory imprint of the native counterclaim. In their deployment, each of these strategies, which are not mutually exclusive, attest to the persistence of the problem of natives' exteriority to settler sovereignty. I want to go on to this business of how the native counterclaim imprints itself on settler social formations. This persistence accounts for the structural dimension of invasion, which has to suppress or at least contain the native alternative across time. As observed, the structures are not inert. They are constituted through events, through practices that colonizers repeatedly strive to maintain in various shifting adaptations to natives' stubborn exteriority. Even in settler colonial discourse, albeit in the breach, native sovereignty does not end with conquest, any more than native ownership ends with dispossession. Moreover, since natives seek to exercise their countervailing sovereignties in whatever ways remain practical, settler domestic discourse becomes refractorily politicized. As Philip Deloria observed of the post-frontier USA, while military conflict was no longer an option, the struggle between native people in the United States had not concluded. Across Indian country, the recognition of military defeat had pushed native people to develop alternative strategies for continuing the struggle, in which connection Deloria stresses the struggles waged on the cultural front. This continuity, the ongoing refusal of a unilateral extinguishment, is also the import of the oft-repeated, deeply unsettling Australian Indigenous maxim, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. In seeking to suppress this autonomous counter-history, settler discourse is trapped into conceding institutional life to the very problem it seeks to eliminate. For something to be suppressed, it must first exist. By its very charter, an Aborigines Department or an Office of Indian Affairs attests to the persistence of the native problem. Despite itself, it stands as an institutional trace of native resistance which it reluctantly acknowledges. During the era of the frontier, this is only to be expected. Territory, together with its native population, remains to be conquered, so there remains an acknowledged external threat that requires institutional management. In the wake of the frontier, however, the continued need for institutional management becomes anomalous, attesting as it does to the persistence of an unreconciled externality that proclaims conquest not to be complete after all. So far as conquest remains incomplete, the settler state rests, or more to the point, fails to rest, on incomplete foundations. For the settler state, therefore, the struggle to neutralize Indigenous externality is a struggle for its own integrity, an end to which assimilation offers the most effective means. This is where race comes in. Once settlers deprive natives of their bare usufruct, natives' territoriality becomes inoperative as a source of subsistence, relatively so. For the duration, therefore, their ownership, perforce detached from its object, becomes reduced to its political dimension. Whether or not settler legal systems formally acknowledge this continuing ownership, or regardless of the extent to which they acknowledge it, it remains registered in other domains of settler social life in particular cultural and administrative ones, which address natives' unique relationship to the national polity in a variety of distinct ways. Administratively, for instance, the political nature of the native problem is apparent in the disproportionate amount of energy that is devoted to a numerically insignificant group, a preoccupation that is unsuccessfully belied by the common conflation of native affairs with administrative concerns such as crime, insanity, and related forms of delinquency or neglect. For the external to be rendered internal, in other words, the political is rendered technical. A well-known, if premature, example of this device was the transfer of the US Office of Indian Affairs from the War Department to the newly created Department of the Interior, which took place in 1849, when the US cavalry had barely set hoof on the Great Plains. Comparably, though much more recently, in Australia in 2006, the ostensibly Indigenous-run Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was replaced by a more openly government-run Office of Indigenous Policy Coordination, housed in the Portmanteau Department of Families, Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. In rendering Indigenous issues a technical problem for specialists, typically embedded in the welfare bureaucracy at a substantial remove from the diplomatic service, the settler state seeks to depoliticize them. In its ostensibly biological incarnation, race presents as a technical issue par excellence, the disciplinary preserve of natural science. As such, race is amenable to a range of scientific procedures, in particular measurement. In the case of practices such as skull measurement and IQ testing, the politics become overwhelmed by the objective technicalities of numerical reasoning. I don't know if anyone's read much 19th century skull measurement, but they're incredibly difficult things to measure, skulls. They're kind of irregularly curvilinear, and the solution to comparing them ended up being coming down to things like filling skulls with shot or with millet, seeing which would fit the most. Needless to say, grave robbery did not enter into these considerations. They became technicalised. While Indigenous people in Australia and the United States have both been discredited on the basis of such computation as IQ testing, skull measurement and so on, the preeminently racial technology that has been applied to them has been the measurement of blood quantum. As various scholars and activists have pointed out, blood quantum discourse serves to eliminate people from the Indigenous reckoning. While this consequence of blood quantum has been well critiqued, the operative terms of the idiom itself remain largely examined. Why in particular mathematics, the quantum part, and why its particular combination with blood? Posing the question thus highlights the simple fact that blood, being liquid, readily lends itself to quantification. It will be impossible to calibrate, say, culture or politics with comparable precision. Blood, however, is well adapted to sustain the technical vocabulary that supplants the political language of external affairs in post-frontier settler discourse. In this regard, blood is like money, which also invokes liquidity to disguise the social relations that it sustains. As Marx and Engels influentially contended, political ideologies legitimate the hegemony of a particular social group, and they do so by assimilating that hegemony to nature, thus placing it beyond human intervention. As a measurable liquid, blood straightforwardly constitutes an object of natural science, a quality that thereby naturalizes the settler colonial logic of elimination in one of its discreetly technocratic post-frontier modalities. In providing for the social death of nativeness as an exteriority rather than as a tile in the multicultural mosaic, assimilation programs acknowledge the historical tenacity of the autonomously constituted native alternative. To this end, the racialization of Indigenous people in both Australia and the United States has sought to minimize their resistance to the centripetal pull of settler national state formation. The racial characteristics attributed to natives are maximally soluble, encouraging their disappearance into the settler mainstream. For all its obviousness, this strategy can be highly deceptive, even finding endorsement in race studies scholarship. The fact that settler discourse constructs indigenous people as racially fragile does not mean that indigeneity itself is fragile, as if the elimination of indigenous people is substantial matter compared to the exclusion of groups whose alterities are deemed immutable and essential. This problem can arise when the critique of essentialism is applied unrigorously, with essence mistaken for equality, duration in this case. Those whose racialization promotes permanent exclusion can figure as more substantially racialized than those whose racialization promotes permanent disappearance. Thus it is necessary to stress the centrality to post-frontier settler discourse of the claim that it is of the essence of nativeness in settler discourse to be multidimensionally soluble, culturally, genetically, all sorts of ways. As the distinctive feature of indigenous peoples' post-frontier racialization, this solubility maintains and reproduces the historical elimination of the prior owners of the land. Well, with 7 minutes to go, I'm sorry, I'll be much briefer about Australia. The major point in relation to racial discourse in this country that I was trying to make there was that there is this tendency to discuss race in the United States almost exclusively in terms of African Americans. These are nothing against African Americans, obviously. I'm not entering into some sort of competition. What I'm rather saying is that the emphasis on the racialization of African American people and how it's essential and permanent and can resurface through generations and one drop's enough and all that, that should not be allowed to put into the shade the racialization of indigenous people who are racialized rather than in terms of permanence, in terms of fragility, in terms of dissolvability, that can be assimilated into the white stock. That's a method of removal. So that solubility, that fragility, is as positive a factor in US racial discourse as the permanence attributed to the descendants of the enslaved. This goes back, obviously, very simply to the requirement for the reproduction of slaves to be maximized, they being useful commodities, okay, as opposed to the requirement for the expropriation of indigenous people for their land to be maximized, therefore they get in the way of the settled project. So from the very beginning, the removal of indigenous people and the reproduction of enslaved people as a basic opposition. To take this through to the present, where one comes across that there are a number of books on race in America, in which indigenous people hardly figure at all. It's overwhelmingly black people, and to a lesser extent Latin American people, and so on and so forth. It's as if indigenous people aren't part of race politics. Well, that in itself is participating in a race politics which eliminates indigenous people from the reckoning. Okay? So, in that sense, the books on race recapitulate their own object, right, by reproducing the solubility racially of indigenous people. So the one thing I want to stress is the thoroughly positive nature of that negative. Okay. So far as Australia is concerned, I kind of tell the basic story of the conquest and colonisation of Australia, and then move into the frontier era, post-frontier era, to discuss this kind of general proposition I've been making about the shift from a politics of native conquest to an internalised discourse in which native affairs become the technical preserve of welfare bureaucracies. So the politics become turned into a welfare issue. It's tied up with poverty, with alcohol, with all these other things which people other than diplomats are deputed to deal with, and that's a broad context in which my computer's gone to sleep. I'm afraid you're going to have to see my horribly messy screen. This is embarrassing, right? I'll hide it quick. What I'm doing here, I'll cancel it. I want to know. So that is the kind of broad context within which I use this picture. This comes from a book published in 1947 by one A.O. Neville, who had for 25 years been the senior administrator of Aboriginal affairs in Australia, being the ironically titled Protector of Aborigines for Western Australia. The book Rabbit Proof Fence figures him, the film Rabbit Proof Fence figures him centrally. When he retired at the end of World War II, the stolen generations had yet to become a real political issue, but there was a certain sensitivity. So Neville published this book entitled Australia's Coloured Minority, Its Place in the Community. Coloured, in Australian parlance at the time, meant people of mixed genetic ancestry, Aboriginal and white. There's a whole other story which I can't go into about people of mixed Aboriginal and non-white ancestry that, I'm afraid, has to be left for another day. It's a fascinating story, an appalling story too. This book constituted a kind of apologia for his role as protector, in which he oversaw the official kidnapping, invariably without consent, invariably violently, of thousands of Indigenous children, and they're taken away to workhouses, really. He had been confronted, he said, many times by prospective adoptive parents of Indigenous children, with the concern, backed up by a kind of 19th century anthropology, with the concern that there might be atavistic throwbacks whereby their nicely light-skinned baby that they adopt can produce black grandchildren. Right? This was the fear that he sought to allay by this picture. Sorry about the terminology, but in order to nail racist terminology, you have to explain how it operates. Right? This picture is intended to show that by adopting this boy, you're not going to have black grandchildren, that the Aboriginal genes progressively breed out. Okay, there was a bogus anthropology associated with this, whereby Aboriginal people were displaced Caucasians somehow way back, a couple of ice ages or something, and they would breed out. He even goes so far as to say, but if there happens to be some Negro or Afghan mixed in there, then all bets are off. This only applies to Aborigines. It is extraordinarily thorough. This book is published at the height of the Nuremberg trials, okay, 1947. The principal problem is to prove that there will not be atavistic throwbacks. Okay, so this is a kind of rather extreme example of the technicalization, the bureaucratization of the politics of conquest. That's why I included that photograph. That's not bad, is it? 11 past. Okay, so that'll have to do it. I'd like to leave this back up because it's so fantastic. This picture, Jolene, and it's, as Choi has already pointed out to me, I'm going to blow your, there's an inside and an outside there very clearly, right? Beautifully binary, I think, Jolene. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up for some questions and comments. Eric?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Appreciate it. A couple of points I just wanted to raise. Let me raise the first one first, which is about race in U.S. federal Indian law. There are two key cases here. 1845 U.S. v. Rogers, yes, which is the attempt to racialize Indians in a very confusing discourse, actually, which I've written pretty extensively about. But Taney's trying to remove white people from the Cherokee Nation, to separate white people from Cherokees, who are claiming to be Cherokees, so whites who are living there who married Cherokee women who consider themselves Cherokees in a political sense. Then there's Morton v. Mancari in 1974, which politicizes Indians in the classic case in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where non-natives were protesting the hiring of native people for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is almost now exclusively native, and claiming race bias in doing that, and the Supreme Court said no, race bias is not what's at play here. The equal rights constitutional structure is not at play here because Indians are a political entity. They're not a racial entity. So I think in terms of the question of what is an Indian in U.S. Discourse, it's a very complicated question. There actually, while there is a definition of a tribe, the Interior Department regulates tribal identity, it has absolutely no definition of Indian identity whatsoever. And of course, the 336 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. vary in their recognition of who is an Indian and who is not. Some have strong blood quantum regulations. I work with the Navajos, for example. But the Cherokees, for example, have virtually no blood quantum regulations. They rely on genealogical rules going back to the post-Dawes Act regulations. So it seems to me that the question of race and Indians in the U.S. is a very complicated sort of legal, racial issue. Under certain circumstances, Indians are not a race, clearly under federal Indian law. And under broad U.S. definitions of race, they're considered a race. And of course, the tribes themselves, under duress, adopted blood variations on blood quantum regulations in the wake of the Indian Reorganization Act, which rolled back the Dawes Act, where all of this blood quantum stuff reared its ugly head. So some of them clearly have adopted these blood quantum regulations. And we now have a problem, David Wilkins is researching this, of detribalization, where Indian communities now are trying to detribalize members. These are resource fights, as I understand it. So I would say this is, whereas the African-American situation is more, if pernicious, more clear-cut, the Indian situation, pernicious itself in various kinds of ways, is a complex of racial ideology and legal ideology.
You said go. Do you mind if I answer that one?
Yeah,
one at a time? Right.
Yeah.
Firstly, I speak deferentially, right? I absolutely defer to your knowledge, which I'm not challenging. One of the reasons why I distinguished Hawaii, apart from the obvious reason, actually is the rice case, which potentially threatens more than the Mankari, right? It came to the,
right.
where the Hawaiian court went the other way. And I have to say I'm somewhat pessimistic about the long-term prospects of the attitude motivating more than the Mankari. That notwithstanding, I'm not using the term race here in that technical sense, but a juridically encoded sense. I mean, I think you can, obviously there are all sorts of answers to the question, what is an Indian? From Morgan's initial one when he was director of the BIA, trying to work out how to implement the Dawes Rolls, moving on and on. His report had this subject heading, what is an Indian? And this question has recently come up, he says, in relation, but having said we have to be rigorous about blood quantum in defining an Indian. We can't use words like half-breed loosely, like we've been using for a century. He then goes on to say, in the next sentence, he says, John Ross, the well-known half-breed, right? Well, actually, he was a 1/8 breed, given that technicality with respect to John Ross. So I'm not using race in that strict and technical sense. I'm rather saying that these very complexities that you talk about amount, with exceptions obviously, but in terms of an overall drift of an outcome, amount to a system of minimizing the native profile in U.S. society.
No quarrel there.
That's what I mean by racialization.
Yeah, absolutely no quarrel there. So the other question I had to do with the terminology of ownership. So we're talking about two systems of relation to land. I could reference your C.F. Black's book, that Land is the Source of the Law, which I'm sure you probably know. So again, I'll use the Navajos since I work with them as an example. When the elders whom I work with and who carry a lot of the cultural authority of the nation talk about land, they talk about caretaking that land. They don't use a property system of designation, of which ownership is, it seems to me, a part of that terminology of property. It commodifies implicitly land, which in indigenous systems typically is related through kinship. It's not a commodity, it's not fungible. So I just wondered about that particular use. I understand that it needs to be used, again, in a legal sense, because one of the first things in Johnson v. McIntosh that the U.S. did was translate native land relationships into property relationships, not so they could grant those property relationships to Indians, so they could take them away.
Well, diminish them.
Yeah, pardon?
Diminish them.
Then diminish them, exactly,
Yeah.
right. So I wondered about the use of, you used the term ownership to refer to indigenous provenance over land, and I wondered about that usage. I mean, I certainly understand it in one sense in fighting these legal battles around sovereignty and possession, but in another sense it seems to me to be alien to native vocabularies in which land is not a fungible or commodified entity.
This isn't, I don't intend this as a cop-out. It will start off, I think, sounding like one. That's not my business. That's native people's business. How they, how they work their own relationships to their land. I use the term ownership to refuse the distinction between possession, occupation, etc., which is what's available to native peoples, as opposed to fee simple, which is only available to non-natives under the terms of Johnson and McIntosh, and even more so Cherokee and Georgia. Right? Fee simple, which is what we mean by ownership, which is a united, Ula and I have just been having this discussion, which is a unified set of bundles that all go here together into one homogeneous lump, which is owned from one second to the next, ultimately traceable back to a sovereign grant, okay? That sovereign, by definition, not being indigenous. So, ownership stops where nativeness starts. Therefore, using the term ownership about native peoples' right to their land is merely refusing that distinction. Makes sense that it's a broad way of talking, that's all. But I recognise what you say. I claim no authority whatsoever over native people's own apportionment of their relationships to their lands.
Yeah, my point is simply that, the colonial project has been so forceful and so is that its tendency is to translate everything right into a colonial set of terminologies, which it's hard to escape. I mean, the word sovereignty right now is under contestation in native discourse. I'm thinking of work like Taki Alfred, who raises the question, why are we using terminology that is essentially Western located and implies hierarchical relationships? There are other people, a former student of mine, Alvaro Reyes, has written an article about the Zapatistas, looking at their system of governance, which repudiates Western notions of sovereignty. On the other hand, in Worcester v. Georgia, for example, Marshall imposed that term explicitly. He said, treaties and nations are terms in Western terminology which we now apply to Indians. So in a sense that the sovereignty discourse was an imposed discourse coming out already of a co-optation. Again, the drive to co-opt something called sovereignty from native peoples, but in order to co-opt it, just like property, you have first to impose it upon them.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, had Marshall not attributed sovereignty to the Cherokee, then he'd have had to surrender Indian affairs to the Georgian government. Right. So there was a federalist project involved.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This has been extremely generative. I hope that you're open to sharing a copy of it. What you're saying about on two different levels is playing out right now, right in Hawaii, in terms of the Mauna Kea struggle, and also in terms of right now, for almost over a year at this point, there have been Hawaiians occupying Mauna Kea to prevent the building of a very, very, very environmentally destructive telescope. And so there's all kinds of fights about that, and there's all kinds of ways that regulation is being used to prevent Hawaiians who want to occupy that land in a Hawaiian way to not go, but tourists to still be able to access that land. So there's all this happening. Simultaneously, there has been decades of attempts to politicize the relationship of Hawaiians to the United States in the same way that American Indians have been. And this is really tricky because in the scope of things it has been to the benefit of American Indians to be federally recognized in terms of all the complications of that. Obviously that's got a million problems that I don't want to discuss here. So that then gets translated into Indian support for Hawaiians, like in a positive allyship way. We want to help you get federally recognized. It's like, no, Hawaiians do not want to be federally recognized for a whole other set of issues. So they had Department of Interior hearings about this last year, and they went and they put a lot of it in Indian country, hoping that Indian people would be like, yes, we support this, and instead there was really an outpour of both Hawaiians and non-Hawaiian allies going, no, 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 and it was real embarrassment for them because they were televising it. So they've ignored all of this and going through all these different ways to get the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as a state agency, which is also simultaneously supposedly representing the national lands of Hawaiian people, to be the same thing. So they're setting up a role right now, right? This is the second or third time that this has been tried. So Hawaiians, sign up and threats. If you don't sign up to be recognized, your children and grandchildren, etc., may be lost from being counted as Hawaiians. So Hawaiians are terrified looking at what's happened post-Dawes. So there is enormous dissension in the community now about should you sign up for this ridiculous, incredibly screwed up, incredibly corrupt process, because what happens if it goes through? And then others who are like, no, never, no, our ancestors have been vocally protesting this, from the beginning of the, illegal occupation, invasion, overthrow of the kingdom. So this is live right now, both of those things. Land, who gets to use land, and let's recognize you so we can take that land, right? Because this whole project is about making a recognizable Hawaiian entity that then the resources can be taken from legally.
Exactly. There's by no means a parallel, but something similar, I believe. This is not coming down the tablet from the mountain, but the management of Aboriginal affairs in Australia took a kind of an important shift in the early 1990s with the Mabo case, where native title got recognised. Up until 1991, Indigenous people had no recognised rights whatsoever. It's commonly referred to as terra nullius, which actually technically is not the case. That wasn't a 19th century term, but it might as well have been. The lack of recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty meant the lack of recognition of Aboriginal ownership. Terra nullius is often translated as the claim that Australia was uninhabited. This is not it at all. It is rather the claim that the inhabitants had not reached a level of civilization which was commensurate with property ownership. Therefore, their relationship to Australia was like that of, say, penguins to Antarctica. They were there, but their being there didn't constitute ownership. Therefore, no need for compensation, no need for anything else at all. That obtained in Australian law until 1991, when native title was recognised, and the High Court of Australia said, sorry, it's been a mistake all along, we never meant to say you didn't actually, there is such a thing as native title. Now, I think what relates to what Lisa just said about native title is that native title legislation, which came after the case, provides very narrow criteria for who you have to be to successfully claim your native title. You have, in fact, the most important thing is you have to have what's called continuing association. When it's boiled down, continuing association means you have to prove to a white anthropologist that your people have been there unchanged since Captain Cook arrived, basically. I mean, this is vulgarising it, but basically it amounts to that. You have to have a dreaming, you have to have a language, all the rest of it. Now, the majority of Aboriginal people have been forcefully removed from their homelands, have had their language and their religions prohibited, have been thrown together with other groups of natives, therefore the shared lingua franca is English, and all the rest of it, the whole mission disaster story. They thereby are excluded from native title. They haven't got continuing association. In other words, the practical formula under which native title operates goes as follows. The more you have lost through colonial invasion, the less you stand to gain from native title legislation. So now what does the Australian state gain from native title legislation? It gains the capacity to extinguish. You can't extinguish something which you don't even acknowledge to be there in the first place. So prior to the granting of this very dodgy right called native title, Australia was in the openly absurd, palpably racist situation of not acknowledging any rights whatsoever to the people that they had conquered. You can't get away with that. So native title is a kind of formula for conceding as little as possible in return for international respectability and the native character. And I think that's got some, there are some resonances.
That's how tribal recognition works in the Department of Interior. And they're denying tribes petitions precisely based on what you described.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk, by the way, in the piece. It was really useful for me. And I guess the question that I had with both, and especially in your talk now, was you talk about how in the official, like offices like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's this trace of resistance to elimination because there's already the recognition that like Native people haven't been eliminated. And the idea that the settler state continues to rest on this incomplete foundation. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of the ways that that can be exploited, if you could speak more directly to that.
Yes, I'll try to. I mean, great question, thank you. My hesitance comes from this, I'll overcome it. But my hesitance is basically, it is not my place to tell native people how to overcome their own oppression, right? For obvious reasons. Basic issue of positionality. As soon as I start doing that...
I guess a better question would be, have you noticed ways that has been happening rather than like...
No, I mean, I'm not trying to get out of it. I just, obviously, you know, I have to say that, right? You know, it has to be counterproductive for me to come along and tell Aboriginal people how to free them. You know, Trotsky had this line about the fat man on a donkey. You know, and this huge fat man's driving, you know, donkey's back breaking, and the guy's riding along saying, how can I help this donkey? You know, that's the problem, right? So, two things. One, I, in my work, do not try to provide recipes or, you know, pointers for native people to adopt. I rather try to provide an analysis which I offer, and I hope that they find it useful. Okay, that's number one. Number two, and I don't mean what would I do if I were a native, I mean what have I observed as being effective, and I think things are changing. Firstly is international solidarity between native peoples, and I think Palestine is crucial in this regard. The recognition of that commonality clearly, you know, would be of great assistance to Palestinian people if Native Americans more generally, I mean some are already, you know, were to express that the commonalities in those experiences. In Australia, for sake of example, when the Stolen Generations apology was finally presented, which also was full of hells, but it's another story, that came late because governments have successively said, we know these terrible things happened, and they were awful, but that was, you know, 3 generations ago. We're not responsible, we didn't kill anybody, we didn't steal anything, don't blame us, yes it was. Well, you can't say that, and at the same time say, as one Australian Prime Minister said, Israel is in my DNA. That is what Kevin Rudd said. So you can't say, we're not part of native dispossession, and at the same time endorse native dispossession elsewhere. So, you know, in that sense, I think that Palestine is a particularly significant question for solidarity, which generally is, I mean, the UN Declaration, I mean, it has its limitations, obviously, but it's not a huge step forward internationally, and the kind of linkages which the internet allows. So I think that the possibilities for sharing provide natives with opportunities to demonstrate the contradictions and the inconsistencies in their own countries' foreign relations policies in ways I think could be productive. That's one possibility I would thought.
perhaps for one more question to Jolene.
Thanks again, Eric. This has been really, certainly challenging to think about. And so thinking about having attended the session yesterday and this morning, if you could maybe just tease out from your experience in the American academic setting, your perceptions of the reception of the absence of the racialized connection between indigeneity and its absence in the American racialized discourse, your experience with it. Because I was somewhat shocked yesterday in the seminar that it was a potent idea in the room, but not ever like embraced or acknowledged as far as positionality is concerned.
This is such a good question. My difficulty here is I don't know the US Academy well enough.
Okay.
But, you know, for instance, I did a year at Harvard 3 or 4 years ago in the history department. I was a research fellow in US history at Harvard. I mean, I kept saying, when are they going to find me out? You know, they didn't anyway. And I came term for my seminar. You know, it was a seminar on race and imperialism. And I presented on native affairs. It was like I was talking about goldfish. You know, what's this guy doing coming here? He's not talking about African Americans or Chicanos. I mean, they were very polite, but they were bemused. It just, you know, this is a different department. And sorry, I don't mean to insult this department by saying it, but you know, it's kind of quarantined as native things, and they go on over there, you know, the other side of the parking lot, and then, you know, we do race history. All I can do is endorse your observation. I haven't got much to say about it.
So then what I'm observing is what you have experienced, that you put it out there, but it's just not picked up.
Apparently, yes.
Well, the country still runs, you pointed it out, Patrick, black-white binary. Even though the population, the demographics are completely different than that. And that's because, you know, when Obama made his speech in Charleston, when the 9 black people were murdered there, he said, and I have a piece on this in Counterpunch, but he said the primal crime in America was slavery.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the things I wrote is I said, no, the primal crime is genocide, the taking of native land, because you can't have slavery without that first sort of gesture. But I think that his thinking along these lines is, you know, for American slavery is acknowledged, but native genocide is absolutely erased. That's the one confrontation that we don't want to have. So historically, I addressed 70 undergraduates the other day and talked about Cornell and Indian country. None of them, all of them knew about slavery, of course. None of them, maybe 2 or 3 out of the 70, had any instruction in native history in high school. It was non-existent. So the use of the word genocide was new to them. All of this was new to them. Not that they weren't receptive; they were receptive to it, but it just had not been present in their education. And Cornell's gone a long way, actually, I should say. We know that in denying its location, in not publicizing the way it should or announcing it the way it should that we're on Cayuga land. So, I mean, one of the things I told those students is if you don't know where you are, you don't know how to act.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, look, there's a minor little cameo in relation to the sort of armistice. This edited collection that I've got is dedicated to Leonard Peltier, and it's right. To Leonard Peltier, free him. Right? That's the dedication. Only 4 or 5 people know this. No, 24 or 5, but every single one has responded completely independently with, "Do you think Obama will free him?" There's something in that in relation to you know, and the fact that he hasn't, I think in what you say, I find that illuminating.
Yeah, well, Clinton didn't either, and he had a chance to. He gave, he freed some awful rich tax offenders and did not speak to the Confederates.
But I think one thing that I think shadows what Jolene brought up is in the American imaginary, the story of slavery is over for the most part. And the story of native dispossession is ongoing. And I think that's the reality that was obviously haunting the room yesterday, that no one wanted to bring up.
Nobody.
No one wanted to own that or address that intellectually, or least of all emotionally. And I think only a few of us could address it experientially. But that was the elephant in the room that you were trying to point out. And I think it's probably one of the, I was hoping we were going to talk about the binaries thing today, because I was hoping to talk about something that Eric brought up in a piece where he said that native philosophies are narrative instead of dialectical. This is an instance where settler philosophies are very much narrative. There's a story of the beginning, a middle, and an end of slavery. But the experience, the racialized experience of both the descendants of slaves as well as indigenous people is dialectical.
Well, one of the things about slavery is, of course, it's not over. The prisons, Michelle Williams has pointed this out. It's just that we like to think it's over in the way I think that Americans like to think Indians were long gone in the 19th century.
Right.
I mean, there's a similar kind of mystification.
I'd qualify that. I mean, I think slavery is over. The mode of oppression has shifted, however.
Yeah, well...
There's a continuity, there's not continuity of slavery, whereas territorial dispossession is not over.
Yeah.
Right.
True enough.
Yeah.
True enough.
Well, for those of you familiar with our seminar, we typically provide a lunch, a light lunch, where we can continue on in some informal discussions, but then we shift into an actual time with our guests for the students who are enrolled in the course. So help me thank again Patrick Wolfe for such a stimulating conversation.
Thank you for your hospitality. It's been great.